Welcome to United Shades of Gray, Conversations of Race in America on 100.5 and 790 News Radio WSGW and online at WSGW.com. Here is your host, Kareem Bowen.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to another edition of United Shades of Gray, Conversations of Race in America. I want to give a shout out to all of my listeners that are out there. Thank you for your continual listenership. I'm in the studio with my main man, Chandler P. in the place to be. What's going on, Chandler?
Not a whole lot. Having a good time.
That's it?
No, yeah, my life is work, and then I go home, and I'm like Dracula. I lay in my bed, and I don't come out until, usually it's when the sun comes up, but then I come out and I go straight to work.
Wow, okay. That sounds like a routine. I want to thank you guys all for tuning in. If you're listening to us via social media on United Shades of Gray, on WSGW, if it's Instagram, YouTube, whatever version of our show you're catching on social media, we want you to like, tag, and share this conversation so that everyone can get involved. I think these are prolific conversations on race. It's interesting, Chandler, we were talking a little bit before we started recording on today, and we were talking about how so many people are not tied in or connected as it relates to racial issues. And you were talking about coming from a small town. Sometimes you're like going, I'm so ashamed. But there's a lot of people out there that just haven't had the experience or the exposure. Where did you get your experience, your first experiences with people of other races and become a bit more diverse?
I actually think because my dad worked at SVSU, so I'd come around here all the time because he would take me to work, and we'd hang out on campus, and you get exposed to a little bit of this and that over time, and it builds up.
It builds up over time.
It builds up over time.
Like Teflon. All right. We appreciate it. So we're excited to have this conversation. And today we have what I would consider a very important conversation that I would really want personally for you all to lean into as we talk today. We're going to talk about this whole concept. There's a lot of conversation going on right now about voting rights and voting rights regulation and Jim Crow laws of the 21st century. And I want to talk to you guys and really just give a breakdown from the Black perspective, what voting rights mean, what it's about, and really give you a historical understanding of why what is taking place today is so detrimental to the lives and in the lives of African American and people of color all the way across the board. So there are a couple definitions that I think that are going to be very important for us to have, and I'll give them to you now, even though I want to talk about what's hot off the press. And one of those definitions is POC. You'll hear the acronym POC. POC simply means person of color or people of color. And when we use the term POC, we're referring to anyone who is of a non-white status. So that may be Hispanics, that may also include Asian Americans, Native Americans, or indigenous individuals. Indian or when I say Indian Americans or Asian Pacific Islanders, it's anyone, and including African Americans, it's anyone who is not a Caucasian. I was going to say Caucasoid because when you look at these words, in terms of what's anthropological words, you end up with these words Negrozoid and Caucasoid. When anyone who's not Caucasian or white, okay, is considered a POC, a person of color. So I want to make sure I don't want to be offensive to anyone. I just want to make sure that we're clear in terms of our understanding. Then the other definition that is important, and this is the definition that we're going to be using as we have this conversation today about voting rights. I'm not talking about POCs. I'm not talking about people of color. I'm talking about ADOS. That's ADOS. And ADOS means African descendants of slaves. So the conversation that we have today are going to be talking about the legacy holders or the generational individuals that have emanated from those who were slaves once here in this country. So we're talking about Black folk and their ancestry lines as we continue. So we're going to talk about the voting rights in the perspective of ADOS, African descendants of slaves, black people. All right, so I wanted to make sure that you understand that, because sometimes you may hear these terms and these acronyms and you're kind of like, what in the heck are we talking about now? Especially when it comes to black folks, because we have been Afro-Americans, we've been Negroes, we've been all kinds of things. But, I'm good with calling us black. I say black all the time, so I am fine with the word black people. Don't be afraid. No one's going to point you out. Oh, my God, you call blacks. Well, I am a black man, and black comes in all shapes and sizes and shades of color. So blacks is an appropriate term to use when referring to black people. But if you're speaking with a group of people and you want to be better inclined to really say it, African American is an acceptable term, but I like to use the term ADOS, African descendants of slaves, because it leaves no gray area in terms of who you're speaking to, because some issues that exist in America were issues that were POCs. And when we talk about voting rights and we talk about what happened in 1865, that was something that affected, even though blacks, ADOS, African descendants of slaves, were the primary individuals, but it opened up a conversation for folks who were POCs, people of color. That included our indigenous Americans, that included our friends from the South who were coming here from Mexico and other countries around the world. So that is very important for us to have a conversation. Somebody's like, wow, I've never heard of that before. Well, that's why we have this show, Conversations on Race in America, here at United Shades of Gray. So let's talk about what is hot off of the press. Well, I really want to have a conversation, and when I talk about these things, these could actually be show platforms for a show entirely of themselves. Now, before we go there, had you ever heard those terms before, Chandler? POC, ADOS? POC,
ADOS is a new one for me.
Okay.
But I'm sure it's been around for forever.
Well, actually, it's probably more of a term that is being utilized more commonly, probably within the last 5 to 10 years. And so if you're not aware of that, it's not like we're creating new things, but it's a distinction, because oftentimes we talk about people of color and many people refer to black folk, but that terminology, people of color, actually refers to a larger group of audience. And so just to make sure there's a delineation between the two is very important. All right. So what's hot off the press? There's been a lot of conversation, and I say this all the time. I don't know if we're becoming angry as a nation, or if what we're seeing take place is the frustration of the day with COVID, with lockdowns, with wearing masks, with all of the mitigation responsibilities that we've been forced to have, missing events, no weddings, no cake. How can you be happy without wedding cake? Every now and then I just go by a bakery, listen, I no one's getting married, but do you have any wedding cake? Because wedding cake is like a delicacy whenever you haven't had it in a while. We haven't had any of these celebratory meals and events for a long time. And so I'm hoping that as we move forward throughout this year that we have opportunities to celebrate, okay? But crime and violence is going unabated. It's crazy. Chandler, I was watching, and they were doing this documentary on really, because now if you do something to someone who's trying to rob your store, you can get sued. It's the craziest thing on the planet, right? So much of the crime that's taking place, especially when we start talking about retail stores and things that are happening. I saw this thing, and it was the craziest thing. There was a security guard. They showed the security guard on duty, and I believe it was a Rite Aid. And this man walks in with his own bags, which is okay. He goes in, he pulls things off the shelf, puts them in his own bag. The checkout counter is straight ahead. He walks straight ahead, and then he just veers and he walks right past the security guard and out the store. And Michael Rappaport, it was him, the actor, Caucasian guy, super funny. He was the one who had seen it, and he videotaped it. And he was just like, why are we acting like this is normal? Like, you can just walk into a store and walk out and no one say anything. The security guard never said a thing, because they've been told not to engage this type of thing. And I think this is crazy. Why have a security guard? I mean, if people know that they can walk by, and obviously this guy didn't hesitate, he didn't run, he didn't duck, he didn't dodge, he just knew that they weren't going to do anything to him. So we're living in a time when crime and violence and these things are going unabated in many of our major cities across the nation. San Francisco, New York City, Fifth Avenue, Philadelphia. We've seen in these major cities this new phenomenon. This has been around for a little bit, but it's coming back, called smash and grab. You ever hear that?
A little bit.
Okay, so smash and grab is really, it is an experience. If you've ever seen this happen. I was out in San Francisco one time, and we were walking somewhere, I think it was the Embarcadero Drive, somewhere around there. And you see, just out of nowhere, you're in the store, and you might get 10, 12 people that just run into the store. And so your first thought is personal safety, like, oh my God, what's going on? People are running. So in America, that means there's an active shooter. But they run in these stores and they begin to smash the display cases. So if there's Louis Vuitton bags or diamond watches or whatever it is, they smash the display cases. They take the contents out, and all of them run out. And it happens so fast and in perfect succinctly that there is really no response, and it's hard for you to gauge. You don't get a look because it's happening all the way around you, and they get out, and usually, very rarely do many of them get caught. And so we see these things happening, and I want to ask you guys, is this something that, this is America. This is not some third world country. And we've seen so many people talk about this concept of law and order, and are we becoming a more violent and a less connected society that we can begin to see these things on a regular basis because they're happening all over the place? So I want to make sure that we're doing this. I think that there needs to be a conversation about what is okay. How can you say that it's not right? You don't have a right to bear arms, but in the same token, I don't want to go, someone comes in, I shoot somebody because my Second Amendment right tells me that I have the right to protect myself, my family, and my property. And then, I end up getting sued and going to prison for some type of issue that's taking place. This is where we are. We've got to reexamine the times and really, what are the important factors of our country that we need to make sure that we hold on to those key fibers. All right, next on the press, right off the press, is I want to ask you a question, Chandler. Life before COVID, what is it that you miss? And this is one of those questions, like, if you can think back, when you think about where we are today, and a lot of things are getting back to normal, there's highs and lows and all this stuff all over the place. What is pre-COVID? What are the one things or a couple of things that you really miss, that you really wish you could just really enjoy the way that you did pre this concept of COVID?
Man, life pre-COVID, saying that out loud, it feels like a decade ago. It feels almost like a lifetime ago. But I really miss, I have an issue where I can't visit people that I want to visit without being prepared to go into a 10-day quarantine after I visit them, because you never know. And it's so stressful to even think about.
It's interesting that you say that, because people don't realize what we go through just to make this show happen. We have been through quarantines. You've had to quarantine. I've had to quarantine, the station being shut down. And so just that whole thing, and then just getting to a place, I didn't know you when we first started this journey together. And I'm like, well, I'm breathing the same air with this dude. Who is he? But getting to know one another and our systems and how we operate, and the fact that, are they vaccinated? Are they unvaccinated? All of these things go through our head because we have people that we love and we want to return home safely too. So the thing that I really would like, I think getting together with people, I'll tell you, some of my best times have been when friends would stop by, or I would stop by their place, or even if they would just stop by my office, my co-working space. And we would just sit there on the sofa or in my family room, and just kick it and laugh. And, after a while, I'm like, oh, it's late. Let's order something to eat. And we could just sit there and veg and not have to worry about, where they've been, putting on a mask. We would laugh and, just all of the closeness and the intimacy of having friends. It's something that I truly miss. And I want to tell you the other thing that I really miss. I miss the freedom of going, and this is going to sound real bad, but going to a place like, if it was a Logan's or a restaurant that's not fast, but maybe a dine-in restaurant situation, and being able to just sit there, no mask, and enjoy your time there, laugh, and just not worry about what's this. The worst thing that you could have was dirty silverware on the table. I miss those things. I miss going to movies because I really struggle with being able to feel comfortable. Because whenever I go to the movie theaters, it's really to get good sleep, okay? It's got the reclining chairs. The temperature is nice and chilly. I put a coat on, and so I got popcorns, beverages, snacks, something to get my attention for a good 15 minutes before I fall asleep. It's the best sleep that I've ever had. I don't feel comfortable going to sleep anymore, so now I'm watching these movies that are keeping me entertained. So I can't wait to get back to a time when I can just really just exhale, be around people, because I'm a very connected individual, and just enjoy good conversation. I really just want to sit down and just have good conversations with people and not have to worry about if I'm, like you said, have to quarantine. Am I taking something back home to my family? And so those simple things are the things that I miss, and I cannot wait to get back to those things. And one day we'll get back. I feel like, one of those Jules Verne's movie, All Summer in a Day, like it's all gone. It's over. Time's ended. But I'm excited about just really, I love Michigan summers. I love being outdoors. I love the open air festivals. Those are things that I capitalize on. And now, since they haven't had me, because I used to be afraid to like go in my backyard and, or even go running, jog down the street, gain a good 30 pounds during the whole COVID period, because they made it seem like if you were walking outside and someone was there 20 minutes earlier, you're going to get sick. So the idea of understanding this thing and being able to move forward is such an exciting thing. All right, so the last thing that I want to talk about, and this is really important because I love my pooch, and I talked to you about this before. I'm a lover of dogs. I've had a miniature, and this was by default. It's not something that I bought for myself, but for my niece, I had a toy poodle, which was supposed to be for her. I spent $800 on this dog, and she has it, and then they decide to move, and in this new location, they can't have it, so I inherited a toy poodle, which barked all of the time, and I thought the dog was half possessed. But my neighbor behind me, Joe, thank God rest her soul, she took the dog in, and she had 4 other poodles, and it was like poodle heaven. So I love my poodles, and I had a golden, a yellow lab. 17 years, can you believe it? From the time that he was born, 8 weeks, until the time that he passed away. Master Cody was his name, and I love my dogs. But now I've heard, and this was something that we were talking about that I had seen on an episode on Fox News, marijuana poisoning in dogs. I think this is crazy. So people, because now everyone's smoking. I don't know. Are you like me? You go to a grocery store and all you smell, you get contact buzzes everywhere you go?
No, I actually haven't noticed it around Saginaw specifically.
Is it because you're the one giving the contact buzzes, or what's going on?
Well, no.
Well, and I don't care if you're a smoker and you're lighting up. It is now legal. It's the law. You can do so, but I promise you, these virgin lungs, I cannot take going to places and you hear this, you smell this pungent smell of, marijuana, and some people don't mind, but for me, it drives me crazy, almost as bad as cigarette smoke. It's just everywhere, and there's no rhyme or reason, race, color. Everybody, it seems like everyone is getting high except for you and I, Chandler, but they're throwing out, pieces of joint, or these edibles are being left around, different things. And so these animal control situations are saying that there has been a 786% increase since 2000, the years before, up to 2019, which is higher than the past previous 6 years of animal poisoning by marijuana. And one of the reasons is because they say that animals, particularly dogs, have additional receptors, cannabinoid receptors in their brain that causes, this cannabis. THC, is it the active ingredient, actually is absorbed. And so you'll see dogs, and if your dog is sitting around and all of a sudden something goes wrong, you don't know what's going on, you think it's just shivering, shaking, oh, it's an old dog. That's one of the key reasons. It's disoriented, it's shaking. Your dog may have been exposed or eaten, cannabis or some brownie. And as we were saying earlier, that when you add like chocolate brownies or chocolate cookies, those types of things, because of the theobromine in chocolate, it becomes even more dangerous. So we've got to begin to lean in for man's best friend. Let's love on him a little bit. Let's make sure that he's okay, so that we're okay, because I'm not okay if my pup's not okay. And so I just was thinking about that. I wanted to give an O out there. And if you have room in your home, and this is a shameless plug, I want you to go down to, let's rescue some dogs this year. I think this is a great year. We all could use a little activity. I've done it before. I'm actually I love big dogs. Are you a small dog, big dog? Are you an animal person?
Cat guy.
A cat guy?
Yeah.
What is it about cats that you like?
They're majestic, but also the dumbest creatures on the planet, and it's just beautiful when a cat is just sitting there looking out the window, and the next moment they accidentally jump into a wall because they thought they saw something. It's amazing.
I've seen the crazy videos. I cannot, we had a cat growing up. My grandmother had one. His name is Max, and he would play the piano, literally walk up and down the keys and make sounds. I'm not a cat person. When they start rubbing against you and, lifting, it's like nails on a chalkboard.
That's love.
No, that's freaky. I'm like, my dog is good. He'll come by. I'm like, go in the corner. He'll go in the corner. The cats never operate on command. I don't get it. They need cat obedience school, because these things do not pay attention. And anything that can spend all of its day running around with a ball of yarn is something that is way beyond me. But anyways, we're going to get to our conversation on today. Thank you guys once again for tuning in. We're talking about voting rights, and I want to talk to you guys from the perspective of POC. Once again, let's do the math. Let's do a test, quick test. What is POC? Once again, my man Chandler, what does it mean?
That is people or persons of color.
There you go. He's got an A for the day. And we're going to talk about POCs. If you guys could see the show that's going on in the studio, you'd fall apart. We're going to talk about that today. And so we're going to start, when we look at the Reconstruction Amendments, and this is what they're called, the Reconstruction Amendments, or you may hear the term Civil War Amendments. I'm going to talk of those really quick before we go into our first break. So these Reconstruction and Civil War Amendments are the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments, okay? And these amendments to the Constitution adopted between 1865 and 1870. These were amendments that were a part of the implementation of what we now know as the Reconstruction era of the American South, which occurred after the Great Civil War. Now, why do they call it Reconstruction? Because basically what we had working wasn't working. And so we had to reconstruct our value, our ideas, and our identity in terms of who was an American citizen. And so the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment address for ADOS, which is?
That was African descendants of slaves.
Right. All right. African descendants of slaves. So we were talking about it affected ADOS, but it also included provisions in there for POCs, which is what?
People or persons of color.
Persons of color. So it talked about African descendants of slaves and POCs, and it gave them some privileges and it opened up opportunities. We'll talk about what those are, how those have operated, and how they manifested shortly after this break. But as we get in here, I want you to think we're going to have a quick lesson on history, because when we talk about voting rights today, it's important for us to understand historically what this means, because then you will understand why so many people are impassioned and emboldened for their fight to stand up for their right to vote, and why it means so much to many of us. Stick and stay. Don't go away. We'll be back with more United Shades of Gray.
You're listening to United Shades of Gray on WSGW.
Hey, this is Kareem Bowen, and welcome back to United Shades of Gray, Conversations of Race in America. Right before the commercial break, we were talking about the reconstruction of the Civil War amendments, and we were talking about what they meant to ADUS, which is African descendants of slave, and how they also impacted POCs, which is referred to as people of color. And we're going to talk about what the 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendment meant, what they established in that moment, because I want to take us on a journey. I want us to look at this from the perspectives of blacks in America and understand why what we're seeing with this voting rights bill that is out there, that is looming, the John Lewis bill and other bills that have been presented are so important to communities of people who have been a part of this disenfranchised group. So Congress passed the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which basically outlawed slavery. So the 13th Amendment outlawed slavery before the Civil War had ended. Once the war was over, white Southerners passed laws. These laws were known as black codes, okay? And these were to keep freedom from exercising their rights. And Congress responded by passing a Civil Rights Act of 1866 to ensure black citizenship. Now, I need you all to understand that when the Constitution was written, during that period of time, blacks were slaves yet here in America, and they were only considered, and this is the truth, you can go check your history books, they were considered to be 3/5 human, and so they were not even considered to be a full human or full man or woman. And I'll tell you that one of the reasons why this is necessary is that you cannot treat anyone with the level of disdain that happens in slavery. It's not indentured servants like we hear some people happening. For those of us who come across from Ireland or some of these other areas, this is slavery like we've never seen it. The most cruel form of punishment to an individual that we've seen. The Holocaust, those who are part of that would also understand that when we talk about the Holocaust, we talk about slavery, we're talking about some of the most heinous things that have happened to people in our world's history. So slavery is one of those things. And so black people were not considered to be human, only 3/5 at that point. And so when we look at the 13th Amendment, it outlaws the idea of slavery. Okay. And that's why I say we can say that it banned slavery, but it outlawed the idea of slavery, that it was no longer considered ethical for a nation to enslave its people. And so blacks, African descendants of slaves from that point moving forward, were free from the perils of slavery according to the 13th Amendment. All right, so this would go on. Congress overrode President Andrew Johnson's veto and went even further, passing the 14th Amendment. So the 13th Amendment comes to set black folks free from slavery. The 14th Amendment then comes, and when enfranchised now African Americans began exercising political power, white Southerners and organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan, something that we've heard of in our past, targeted them with violence and intimidation, especially after 1867. To protect black voting rights, Congress then passes the 15th Amendment. And the 15th Amendment did not outlaw literacy tests, poll taxes, and other forms and methods that might prevent poor blacks and whites from voting. But it did begin to set the pathway for something great to take place as we move forward to the 1960s. After congressional passage, constitutional amendments require 3/4 of the states to approve them. By 1871, 31 states out of the 37 had ratified the 14th and the 15th Amendments. So, in short, let's look at this. Congress passes on January 31st, 1865, the 13th Amendment. It was ratified on December 6, 1865, and Section 1 of Amendment 13 says that neither slave nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, and I think it's important that you look like except for a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. It abolishes slavery. All right. Involuntary servitude. You can no longer be a debtor as a slave in this country. Then comes the 14th Amendment, passed by Congress June 13th of 1866, ratified July 9th of 1868, 2 years later. And Section 1 of this, in essence, says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. It provided citizenship to those once enslaved ADOS, African descendants of slaves. But here is where we say that there are other nationalities that existed in the country that benefited from these movements that took place during this period of time, because the 14th Amendment also included individuals who were Native Americans or indigenous people to this country. It also included individuals who were immigrants from Mexico and other countries, and they were now able to establish and become citizens of this great union. And then the 15th Amendment passed by Congress in February 26, and I need you to listen to these days. This is 1869, and it was ratified in February 1870. And now I want you guys to understand, my grandfather was born in 1909. So these are just, 30 some odd years before my grandfather was here in the country. So my great grandmother, who lived to be 101 years old, we called her Mama Pearl. She was alive during this time. So all of this information and all of these things that I'm talking about are things that I heard as a young kid when I would go down to Maringouin, Alabama, Maringouin, Louisiana, just outside of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and sit at my grandmother's house across from the bayou and have these conversations about voting and growing up black and living as a slave and having great-grandparents who were slaves. I shared the story before of how my family was responsible for keeping Georgetown University open, because when the institution was indebted and about to close due to foreclosure, we were sold into slavery to tobacco farms and sugarcane farms from the Maryland area down to Maringouin, Louisiana. So these things are all things that are part of my culture, a part of the history that I have known and grown to know about the Bowen family and the Hawkins family. As a matter of fact, Georgetown named one of the institutions and one of the dormitories Hawkins Hall. So, it's amazing the history that we have and the legacy that exists, be it good, bad, or ugly. It is a part of our history. So Congress passed the 15th Amendment by Congress in February 26, 1869, ratified February 3rd, 1870. And Section 1 of Amendment 15 says that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied. So the 13th Amendment, it abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment then created citizenship opportunities for ADOS, African descendants of slaves. And the 15th Amendment then gives them the greatest power that exists in a democracy. And that was that it allowed them the right that their vote could not be denied, all right, on the account of their race. So as we begin to look at this, we want to look at what has taken place and the erosion of these things that now exist. Chandler, I see you looking at me intently. Is there something that's on your mind that's going on? Is there something happening in your head?
I'm absorbing information intensely.
He's absorbing information intensely. Now, this is not about critical race theory. This is just about American history. And I think that when we understand these key things, it then gives us an understanding of why we have to lean in for these voting rights acts that are taking place on today. So erosion, litigation, and scope, okay? So the promise of these amendments was eroded by the state laws and federal court decisions throughout the late 19th century, before being restored in the second half of the 20th century. So this is what happens. In 1876 and beyond, some states passed what are now called, and we understand they were called then, Jim Crow laws that limited the rights of African Americans. These were the laws that we would see the separate but equal. These were the laws that we saw were, whites only. Blacks could not eat at the dining counters of tables. You couldn't sit at the front of the bus, those types of things. And so we see these things limiting the access for blacks, African descendants of slave, ADOS, in America. And the important Supreme Court decisions that undermined these amendments were the Slaughterhouse Cases of 1873, which prevented rights guaranteed under the 14th Amendment's privileges or immunities clause from being extended to the rights under. And so Plessy versus Ferguson becomes a huge case that now underscores these ideas. Brown versus the Board of Education. This is the idea of separate and equals, the integration of schools, all of those things taking place. But I really want to stay on this track with our voting rights, because we see these things taking place. We saw that in 1965, MLK, Martin Luther King, hero in all of our eyes, who really looked at world leaders such as Mahatma Gandhi and his nonviolent stance and going on hunger strikes and standing silent and peaceful protesting, beginning to jump in and move into organization, which then he pushes in 1965, the Civil Rights Acts, which took place, which then were there to deal and to combat with the issues of voting rights, civil rights, our right to be able to do certain things that were now being alienated. The Constitution provided those things in 1865. The Voting and Civil Rights Acts of 1965 then come in to say, listen, we have these rights, but these rights are being curtailed because now we have states. It was a constitutional amendment. Understand that. So this is federal government coming in, setting these amendments in place, meaning the federal government now bans slavery. The federal government now says everyone has a right to vote. The federal government now says that there are protections for people who are being disenfranchised from the process. So we then have this entrance of these Jim Crow laws, which says, okay, you may have the right, but we're going to make it very difficult for you to do so. So it meant setting up precincts for people of color, and that's people of color. Notice that's all people that were then granted based upon those 13, 14, and 15 amendments, the right to vote. Your precinct may be 50 miles away, and then when you get there, you realize that you needed a piece of mail with your identification. And since you didn't have a car, that meant you were walking 45 miles one way and 45 miles back the opposite direction. So there were these things that were put in place to discourage the right to vote. And so when we begin to look at what happens in 1965 with the Voting Rights and the Civil Rights Acts, we then look at the abolition of things such as the Jim Crow laws and these additional things that were put in place to disenfranchise voter IDs, having to show your citizenship, these types of things which kept people from voting. The fact that you could not vote unless you had to show that you had a job, and those types of things. All of these things were banned and outlawed with the Civil Rights Act of 1965, which was then instituted in 1968. There was also an amendment, okay? But then when we get to 2013, this is where the conversation becomes very interesting, because all of the things and all of the progress that King and the other leaders, Abernathy and Jesse Jackson, did in the 60s, in 2013, the Supreme Court literally gutted out the Voting Rights Act that took place of 1865, enforced in 1965. And what they said basically is that they struck down the fact that now voters who are discriminated have the responsibility of the burden of proving that they are being disenfranchised. And what it does in essence is it removes the protections that based upon the federal government saying that, this is what you have to do. These are the protections. It took the power of overseeing voting rights from the federal government and it placed it back into the state's hand. Up until 2013, if a state wanted to change, a state, a county, any of the lower municipalities, they wanted to change portions of their voting rights bills or acts or anything that related to voting, they would have to have approval from the federal government to ensure that this was not going to disenfranchise individuals who had pretty much very recently been given the right to vote. In 2013, the Voting Rights Act basically gutted all of those rights and gave the responsibility back to the states to govern those things. So the Supreme Court issued one of the most consequential rulings in a generation, and this case was called Shelby County versus Holder. And it was a 5-4 vote. The court struck down a formula at the heart of the Voting Rights Act, the landmark 1965 law that required certain states and localities with a history of discrimination against minority voters to get changes cleared by the federal government. This is exactly what I'm saying, before they went into effect. And so it's really hard to overstate the significance of this decision. The power of the Voting Rights Act was in the design that the Supreme Court gutted. Discriminatory voting policies could be blocked before they went into position, harming our voters. Now that 2013, this Voting Rights Act has been taking place, it completely removed the Supreme Court or the federal government's right to oversee or to have to be consulted in order to make these changes take place. And immediately following this decision in 2013, now this brings us currently, 2013, we're in 2022. I had to think about what year we're in. So we're talking about literally within the past 9-10 years that we see such an amazing change and a turn of events that impacts us in such a way. So immediately after this decision, we see strong holds, really conservative, Republican held areas. These lawmakers in Texas and North Carolina, we see Georgia and Kentucky, 2 states previously covered by the law, moved to enact these new voter ID laws and other restrictions. The moment the opportunity was made available, we saw them slide into action, and the purpose for these voter ID laws was because most individuals who have issues with voter identification or any type of identification tend to fall into POCs, people of color. That includes the African descendants of slaves. A federal court would later strike down the North Carolina law, writing it was designed to target African Americans with almost surgical precision. So when we see now Stacey Abrams, who was running for governorship in Georgia, the great state of Georgia, then coming back a year later and saying, listen, I didn't win my race, but I'm going to empower the system. I'm going to exercise my freedom of democracy and help others, be a part of the American process. And that's really what we're talking about. When we talk about voting rights, the more Americans who are exercising their right to vote, the more beautiful the process becomes. She and her constituency were able to legally register 1 million individuals in the great state of Georgia. This is something that is revolutionary. It has never been done before. And this was done by Stacey Abrams, an African-American female who was later considered a possible candidacy for the 46th president, Joe Biden, running with him, and instead he chose Kamala Harris. But we may never know the full impact of this Shelby County decision. Statewide changes get a lot of attention. Most of the voting changes that the Justice Department reviewed were submitted by local jurisdictions. Now it is even harder to hear about these local changes because there is no noise being made. By the time they go into effect, most of its citizens don't really understand. And there was a documentary, we talked about this, Chandler, something that was on CNN about how the changes are so subtle and they're presented in a way, hey, we're going to create a new voting place. It is a more modern place. It's a cool place. You can social distance in this place. It's got air conditioning. It's a new facility. And we want to move. We're going to combine some voting precincts into this one location, And then they make the change. And what happens is if no one blows the whistle, if no one tells what's really going on, this precinct in Georgia is now struggling because they're going to go, it's a huge area, I think like 100 square mile radius. They're going to go from 7 precincts to 1 precinct because it's beautiful, it's new, it's air conditioned. But the reality of it is it displaces voters by nearly an hour in some places in terms of the location of where they need to go vote. And so these are the types of things that makes it difficult. So if I'm getting home and I'm tired, I'm not going to drive an hour to go vote when before I could drive 10 or 15 minutes to go vote, which would keep me more inclined in the voting process. So these types of things are the things that people are now upset about. The Supreme Court's decision didn't get rid of the voting rights entirely. Congress could restore the full power of the law by coming up with a new formula to determine which places need to submit their voting changes for pre-clearance. That means places that are generally disenfranchised voters, places like Kentucky and Alabama and Texas and Georgia, all of the places that we see happening, Missouri, as some people might say. And so when we begin to look at what is taking place today, when we look at what is on the table, and you asked me a question, Chandler, about like what was in those bills, and we're going to talk about these voting rights bills that are on the table, because my fear is, people look at this as a Democratic stance because the Democratic Party is pushing it. And this is not Democratic, nor is this Republican. This is American. And the American process is one of democracy in which all of its players has an equal share and an equal vote in what is to take place. Now, well, there have been since then a number of voter ID laws that have, they've been found to be very big at disenfranchising individuals. We see those things now creeping back in. We see things taking place in places like Arizona with these restrictions that are keeping people from the voting process. Now, I need you to understand this. This is after the 2020 election. This is after this last election that we saw. According to Brennan Center for Justice, 400 bills with voting restrictions were introduced in 49 states in 2021. So once we began to see that, hey, it's not voting the way that I want it to happen, my party is not getting in, we've got to begin to change some rights. So 49 states in our union currently in 2021 have enacted these voter restriction laws. 19 states have already passed 34 laws restricting access. So someone asked the question, what are these bills that are on the table that we keep hearing? There's been a lot of conversation about the removal of the filibuster or the adjustment of the filibuster. And the filibuster is that method by which we can use a lesser majority to pass laws and to get legislation taken care of. As we were going through this whole initial year of this Biden administration, and they were talking about the Build Back Better plan, and we were talking about trillions, 3.8 trillion. My focus has always been on the fact that, my rights as a black man are an amendment to the Constitution. My freedom as a black man, there were just probably 10 years ago that they had to reinstate and commit to the fact that I would be a free American. And so if the vote is the only thing that is preventing me from going back to Jim Crow laws and going back to a state of enslavement, we understand the importance and the power of the vote and why these votes are so important. So the Freedom to Vote Act, it ensures minimal national standards for voting and prevents partisan actors from interfering with elections or canceling results. All right. Then there was John Lewis. John Lewis was that formidable opponent who succumbed and has passed on. He crossed the Pettus Bridge, John Pettus Bridge, Bloody Sunday. He was the individual that was there, got his head beat in. John Lewis, Voting Rights Act, it prevents discriminatory practices and rules in voting, especially in states where discrimination is persistent and pervasive. These are not red or blue laws. These are American laws. And when I look at it, when they were positioned before the Senate, it was unanimously rejected by every member of the Republican Party. Shame on you. This is not about taking away wins from a Democratic president. It should not be. This is not about politics when it comes to the laws, but this is about making sure that everyone has their fair slice of the American pie. And I don't think that it's fair, Chandler, that my rights as an American, my right to vote, my right to be free, are all amendments and not an original part of the Constitution. But this is why we have the power of the vote. Thank you guys for tuning in. Tune in next week with more conversations of race in America.